Hello and welcome to the Darkside. We are back from our season break. This is episode 14. We are back with doing some educational discussion, debates, and different topics to keep you engaged and interested in the world of everything, really, everything. How you doing, Mr. Storm?
I'm great. I'm always great.
You're so great. I put it on a shirt. Right, so I'm Tabitha Purple, your host. This is Mr. Storm, and we will be discussing this evening unconscious bias. But before we get there, we will have one news story each that we're allowed to share. We're changing up the format a little bit. We're working on it, tweaking it, making it so that we can do the show within an hour, which is not always the easiest part to do, but we can do it. So, do you have a news story for us this week, Mr. Storm?
Let's see. Yeah, there's been so many.
There has, but you're only allowed to pick one.
Right. Okay. So, yeah, geez, now you put me on the spot. Okay, if I have to pick one, because we're going to touch on another one when we kick off into the subject, I'm going to kick off with the fact that Romanian authorities have extended Andrew Tate's detention period for another
Yes.
month.
Yes.
I think that's a fantastic piece of news.
Yep.
The less the man is on the street, the less access he has to the internet and other things like that. I just think the better off society is. He is at the very best. I'm trying to be careful here because there are possible legal charges pending. At the very best, if we cannot say he is criminal, he is at least predatory. And I think when I say predatory, I want people to understand I'm not just talking about predatory towards women. I think he's predatory towards young men as well. He is selling them a product that does not exist and he does not have. And the current model of what he have is quite possibly criminal. And that's according to his own words. I mean, there's videos out there where he himself has potentially confessed to grooming, and a whole bunch of other things. So, look, if I was to pick one news story, I think it's actually a good news story. It's a good piece of news that he has been deprived of liberty for at least another month.
It is. I think where you have a case that touches so many international waters and crosses so many different boundaries and works in a space that is open to abuse in many different ways, like the internet is. I think it's good that the prosecution have been awarded the month to build their case, because of course this doesn't just involve Romania. It doesn't involve just alone one place. And so I think it's really important that we look at how justice systems work, and when they work well, of course, that's a positive thing, and being awarded the opportunity to actually build a case to bring good charges that will stick is an important part of that. Like, it's, people would argue that there are other places that don't do that, but this is, at least in this regard, really a positive step towards helping, because of course the way that the internet works is on whose ground did he commit the crime could be argued, and why prosecute him here. So I think it's an important step of just doing that.
Well, yes and no. It's a bit murkier than that, but also there's actual physical crimes that have taken place
Yes, there are
in
physical
terms of
crimes.
the grooming or possible physical
Yeah.
crimes that have taken place. And I just think one other thing, you know, uh, I don't think anyone who watches Andrew Tate will ever watch one of these. But if you do, can I just say that if you look up to someone whose statement in regards to being investigated by criminal activities is that the Matrix is after me, you might just want to reevaluate your life. That's
There
it.
is that. There is that, right? There is that. Okay, good. All right, I think it's a fantastic news story, and it's a good news story, which is different. Mine is a different kind of news story. Is not such a positive spin, I guess. It's more from the background of please remember those that are close to you in proximity, not just close to you in relationship. So the UK has done a study based. It was based on last year, at the end of last year, and it was to look at the effect of the stark choices that are faced for disabled people in the cost of living crisis. And so the stark reality is that for some disabled people, with the energy costs particularly as high as they are, they're facing the choice between eating and breathing, which people say, well, that's a bit dramatic, Tabitha. Most people don't have that. But then when you break down the amount of equipment necessary to keep some people alive, and therefore this then means that they literally have to choose between eating and breathing, because to put the electricity on to pump all of their equipment means that they don't have enough funds to literally eat, and so you're kind of dooming yourself one way or another. And so there is like some particular news stories. This one is from The Guardian, the report from that, and it highlights one story of Caris Williamson, who has muscular dystrophy, and is permanently on a ventilation machine. And she basically told The Guardian that her home is full of equipment that keeps her alive and out of hospital, which also saves the NHS an absolute fortune. She would not be able to go without any of her everyday equipment and survive. And so the literal cost is there, plain to see. You have a choice to make. Does this woman end up in hospital where all of that costs anyway, or does she get help at home to actually cover the cost of keeping her alive? And I think, there's so many more stories of people with multiple sclerosis, cancer, arthritis, people who use CPAP machines, of course. Those have to run all night long, so on and so forth. There are so many different things, and people are literally choosing between, are they going to stay alive, and is this going to be their last winter? Is this going to be the last time they enjoy life, health, and breath? And it does put into perspective, you're talking about in the UK, it was 700,000 people. Let me see how many people it was. Might not even be that high a number, 7,000. Can't remember the number, can't see it now.
Well, let's put it like this. It's around 10,000 people die each year due to a cold home during the winter period. So
yeah. And so the actual number of people with severe difficulties who are affected by this is around 7,000 people. But that's 7,000 people who will inevitably run into other difficulties. This is people who are missing trips going to hospital, who are making really hard choices that they cannot afford to do certain things. And of course, this includes things like moving. So, of course, for some people, it takes a lot out of them to move, to go places, to do all of that. But when you're having to stack that up against staying still in your house and trying to live, they may choose that option, but that has long-term repercussions for their health in the long term, and thus shortening their life. And so you have this real awful situation where people are really suffering. Yes, it's over 7,000 people that took the survey that this affects, and 68% of respondents said they have had to cut back their energy use, and 55% have said they're less active as a result. And the knock-on effect of all of these things is quite startling, and I think it just goes to show that there are so many people that need additional support, additional help, and it's really important that we keep our eyes open, we keep our hearts open, and we keep voting in ways that would actually improve the lives of those around. They are in the minority, and they deserve to be supported and live and to have a good quality of life. I think to leave people in a state where they're struggling to breathe seems excessive.
Right.
In the right way.
I just want to interject for anyone living in the UK. There was a trial scheme, I'm not sure if it's still going on, in which people with respiratory and cardiovascular problems could get their heating prescribed for them. In other words, the government would pay, or you could see a health professional and they would prescribe heating for you during winter periods. So it might be worthwhile, if you do suffer from one of those conditions, seeing if that trial is available still and in your area.
Well, it's important to say that is a trial. I mean, in this case, the government responds and says there is, for vulnerable households, there is an additional payment of 1,200 plus if you have a disability, £150. On top of this, the government's energy price guarantee will save the typical household around £900. But when your household is not a typical household because electrical equipment is on 24/7, keeping you alive, how is that going to help? And I think that there are different schemes that you can apply to and see if they're relevant to you and see if it's possible in your area. But I do think it behoves us who are able, and look around your own country. If you're not in the UK, of course, look around your own country and see what is actually being done and how these things are being implemented, and which political parties are making moves to actually support people within local governments, particularly, who have needs. And I think that that's just a really important thing, that we who are healthy need to consider those who are not and advocate for them, so that they don't have to take this up as a fight as well. They're trying to breathe, they're trying to live, they're trying to survive. I think they need some of us on their side, fighting their cause. Well, that went quite very quickly.
Well, I don't know what you may say. I mean, the only thing. Look, as I said, the trial scheme
all by myself.
the trial scheme is in addition to those that you mentioned.
Yeah.
No, it isn't available everywhere. But look, if you can get the government to pay for your heating, go for it. At least that way, you just need to now worry about whether you can afford food.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is a whole different challenge.
Listen, it's a whole different challenge. Like, listen, I can't even tell you, man. Like, it kills me every time I go grocery shopping. Listen, half the time I go grocery shopping, I'm tempted to stand outside and see if anyone wants to buy one of the children, because I need to sell one of them in order to afford groceries. I gotta choose, It's like, which one do you love the least?
On that topic, we are going to move swiftly on to our main topic this evening, which is unconscious bias. So I hope you're ready to join in the discussion and have some chat about that. So in true Darkside style, we're going to give you some introductory information, give you some definitions, help you try and understand the subject properly, and then Mr. Storm's going to take us through a particular case study of his that he's interested in, and we're going to discuss how that goes. So let's have a look at some of the terms involved in unconscious bias. A basic definition of unconscious bias is that there are social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals from outside form or out of their own conscious awareness. So you're forming an opinion outside of your own conscious awareness. If I look at another definition, unconscious bias refers to the deep-seated prejudices that we all absorb due to living in a deeply unequal society. Unconscious or implicit bias can lead to instinctive assumptions that a nurse must be a woman or an engineer must be a man, so on and so forth. Unconscious bias can be present even in people who genuinely believe they're committed to equality. It's harder to spot and root out than obvious discrimination. Those are two really basic definitions. There are different types of unconscious bias. Would you like me to take you through a few of those, just for fun?
You can if you want.
Is there a different definition of unconscious bias that you would like us to work with for the purposes of this evening?
Listen, we can work with that. Look, whatever you want, we can work with. However you want to define it, we can work with it.
Okay, so there's a couple of, well, there is at least 10 different versions of what an unconscious bias may look like, and categories within which they work. And they're kind of helpful a little bit for giving examples of what these are. And so I think the thing that we're going to be discussing this evening is what happens when a technical term meets popular culture, and how does those two things interact? Because I think in some ways this can be technical. It's a helpful category for academics to kind of process. It's a helpful category for trainers to help you to understand things. But when it becomes into the popular culture, like a term like woke is, and maybe we'll get to that one day, but what happens to that term, and does it still hold its meaning and value within society once it's become popular, quote unquote? And unconscious bias is definitely one of those things that's become popular. In our case study, we'll talk about that. But here are a few different types of bias that we talk about. So affinity bias, and this basically refers to our tendency to gravitate towards people who are like us. So we tend to have a preference for people who maybe grew up in the same area, or went to the similar types of schools, or did all of those kinds of things, or who look like us. And so if you're working in an environment and somebody happens to mention something that is like you may gravitate to that person and give them unfair treatment, or unfair, biased, positive treatment at the expense of everyone else, because that person is from something that you identify with. Something else is called attribution bias. And this basically goes that we, when we're judging ourselves, talk about how hard we've worked and how wonderful we are. But when we're judging other people, we do not attribute hard work to their situation. We don't attribute those things, and we do it with positive and negative. So when it's a negative thing, we tend to say, oh, that was an unfair situation, how terrible. But when it's in someone else, we tend to judge that as a character flaw. So for example, if you get cut off in traffic, your instinctual response is to say, what a horrible person, instead of maybe they're late, maybe there's a reason, maybe we tend to go to the character of the person and characterize their whole personhood off of one action. This goes to something like beauty bias, which is where we basically favor pretty in different ways, or unfavorably favor pretty by making pretty stupid, or whatever. So there's that. There's confirmation bias, where basically, this one is interesting. So confirmation bias is an unconscious type of bias. So firstly, you already hold a bias against somebody, and then what you're doing is looking to confirm it at every opportunity. So this one you have to dig deep on, and you have to really think about and ponder. Confirmation bias can go like this. Let's say you unconsciously have the opinion that Caribbean people run late. Let's say that's what your unconscious bias is. You don't know where that's come from. It's just an idea that you've got. It's running around in your head. So someone comes in, they're late, they're from a Caribbean background. And what you then think about is that their character must be disorganized. They must be lazy. They must have no respect. I get to hear that a lot in the society I live in. People who run late have no respect for other people's time, which may not be true. And so what you then do is look for instances where you believe that's being confirmed back to you. And so that's confirmation bias. So anything they say that highlights their laziness, or that you think highlights this, you then jump on that and you jump in. You look like you're ready to jump in already.
Yeah, I'm ready to jump in, because you know what, right? I'm tired of that one about people saying, look, if you run late, you have no respect for my time. If you are scheduling a meeting for 9 o'clock or 9:30 on a Sunday morning, it's you, my friend, that has no respect for my time. You have no respect for my sleeping time. So don't talk to me about respect for your time, because you can go, as Dr.
On a month of
O'Rourke
Sundays.
would say, kick rocks.
Okay, so there is things called conformity bias. I'm just giving you the kind of overviews, okay? Gender bias, name bias. So there have been numerous studies that have brought out that if you have particular names in different countries, this will put you at a disadvantage. So African American names in the United States, or Muslim names in the United States, or Muslim names within certain European countries, so on and so forth. So the list is kind of endless of how name bias works. You'll look at two identical CVs, and you will gravitate to the one that is based on a name that you feel familiar or an affinity with, and you will discard the one that has a name that you don't. Contrast effect. This is an interesting one. So this basically pits people against each other, and thereby, by contrast, somebody appears better or worse than another person. Doesn't make them good for a job, just better or worse. And so this really plays in with jobs, particularly within the process of recruitment, where basically you're pitting different people against each other. And once you do that, you can over bias towards a person, not because they're actually good at anything, but because you're contrasting them to what you believe is a bad person, right? And so this then has problematic implications. The halo effect is basically when you identify what you believe is a good characteristic within somebody, and then everything they do looks amazing based on that. Or the horns effect, which is the opposite. You find one negative thing, and that means the whole person gets thrown in the bin. So, for example, a horn effect can be the way someone dresses. You deem that to be unprofessional, and therefore you judge the whole person based on what you don't like about the way that they dress. And we can see that. Sorry, what was that?
Christians.
We can see that in forms of traditional different ethnicity dressing around the world when it comes into contact with Western European white standards. And therefore, this can often have a really huge clash. So if you wear traditional wear clothes, say you're from an African Caribbean background, you wear different traditional clothes, you may be judged differently than those who are wearing the typical European
Christians.
suit and tie. Okay, I'm going to just do the last couple and then I'm giving up because you've got weight bias. Now, that's something that I think is a rather interesting topic, but maybe that's a different topic, not one we're looking at today. But basically, the idea is that unconscious biases are often based on inaccurate or incomplete information. And while people will say the intention is important, they actually do globally impact the way people get recruited, the way people get promoted, how people are treated within the office and in the workplace, and generally within society. One of the huge studies that is often done is about medical professionals and how unconscious bias is actually detrimentally affecting women. One group is detrimentally affecting African Americans or people of African descent, another group, and then is detrimentally affecting those who have the crossover, Black women. And there are study after study that talks about the pain threshold that doctors and nurses believe that Black people mysteriously have, which is we can take higher pain levels. We don't hurt in the way that other people hurt. We don't cut me, I bleed, kind of thing, but they don't believe that that's true. And this goes on to show that there is actually lots of companies that have implemented unconscious bias training. The question is being asked as to whether these things actually work. Is it true that there's unconscious bias? And do these trainings actually help the situation, or do they further embed problematic ideas? And so, yeah. There are a number of companies that have done this, particularly throughout the US, and a number of companies who've been criticized about how they are doing it. But I think one of the things that we need to do is, instead of rejecting the idea of unconscious bias training, is to actually look at what we're doing, how we're doing it, and why we're doing it. So the UK Civil Service scrapped the training in late 2020 because they believed that it was not helpful. But
Stories.
they they basically used a piece of research ineffectively, and so they said that basically unconscious bias training has little to no effect on the actual outcomes that they're seeking for. However, most companies do not engage with the training in any kind of deep and meaningful way. They expect that in 1 hour they are going to fix a lifetime of problems in an hour in a company. That's not going to fix the issue. You're talking about multiple people who have, if you have unconscious bias, this is bias that's been put in since childhood. And so your company is now looking at conservative 20 years worth of unconscious bias through society, through whatever, within an individual. And then collectively, if we then look at the collective bias, which is something where basically peer pressure then pushes you towards a certain kind of bias, you're then looking at trying to undo conservatively 20 years, but on average workforces are around 40 years old, right? So the average age is around 40. So at least 40 years worth of problems that have built up, and you want to get it done in a 1 hour training session. And in some of these cases, 20-minute training sessions. And so this is one of the huge debate issues at the moment that is going on within anti-racism circles, where the trainers, the people that are working are hitting 2023 feeling really disappointed. 2020 was a massive year. There was so much that was happening surrounding Black Lives Matter, surrounding anti-racism work, surrounding people feeling like they woke up. And in 2022, some of these issues are now worse than they were then. For example, police violence. 2022 was one of the biggest years of police violence, killing more Black people than ever before, on official record, of course, because records that went beforehand weren't recorded. They just did that stuff. And so the question for 2023 is, well, what are we doing and how can we do this better? And why is it there is such an apathy towards this? But the question that we're looking at today is unconscious bias. And is it real? Is it really unconscious? Is it conscious bias? Yeah. Let's bring Mr. Storm in and see what his takes are on some of these issues and look at our case study for this evening.
Right. I want to kick this off. There's a saying, I'm going to have to paraphrase it because I can't remember the exact words, but to the powerful, justice looks like oppression. And I think that's one of the things we need to bear in mind when dealing with these things, and some of the reticence and pushback is that we are speaking to the powerful demanding justice. And that will often feel like oppression because your power affords you benefits that you would not get without oppressing others or without the oppression of others. Now, the story that came to mind is one that came about this week in the UK, in which the football manager of a team called Crawley Town was found to be unconsciously racist. Or he was not consciously racist. Right? Now, this man has decades worth. He has a decades-long catalog of abuse. Now, the abuses that he was charged with by the Football Association of the UK were not ones going back decades. Now, the reason I know he has one that goes back decades long is because I was listening to the radio this week, and someone called in who he had coached as a child and spoke about the abuses he was receiving then as a child, right? And he spoke about the fact that he felt powerless. And at the time, there was nothing he could do because who would believe him? Not just that, but also the time period in which he's talking about is a British society that I am all too familiar with.
Mm.
Um, and that is that your concerns aren't taken seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of the charges that this football coach was charged with were he told a Muslim player that he couldn't wear a fitness tracker vest because his people blow things up when they wear vests. He told another one that what was it? Was he upset that they didn't make curry pizzas? He told I think he asked a black guy from the Caribbean who had just come back from representing his nation, how did he get so dark when he went away? And it's just a litany of abuses like this. Now, how you can say, because from what I gather, he had had interventions before and none of the behavior stopped. So how you can say, or how you can arrive at the conclusion that he wasn't consciously racist staggers or beggars belief. That is until you understand one of the questions that the panel asked him.
Okay.
And that was, are you consciously racist?
Huh? What?
Now,
What? I don't understand the question. Who's gonna who? I mean, what kind of a silly? Of course, nobody's. Well, no. Let me rephrase that. Only a certain group of people with a certain kind of mindset, which are a very small minority, are going to answer, "Yes, I'm a racist." No one's answering, "Yes, I'm a racist." Who's answering it?
Actually, even that minority of people are not going to say yes if they wish to remain gainfully employed.
Well, arguably, the only reason they would be asked that question is because they're not gainfully employed. So that's what I mean by there's a very small minority of people who would actually answer, "Are you a racist?" "Yes, yes, I am."
Right. So
who's going to answer that question? What are you talking about? Sorry, anyway,
So
continue on.
within this case, and when you look at their summation and the conclusion that this so-called independent panel arrived at, you can see that they have given what I would argue is an undue weighting to that answer to that question. That's the only way you can arrive at the conclusion he's not consciously racist. But what the question does, it takes into account his motive rather than his intent. Because there's a difference between motive and intent.
Okay.
Right. So, I meant to punch you in the nose. I did not intend to break it.
Oh, I see.
Right?
So
So his
meant to
motivations.
insult them. He just didn't mean to be racist.
That is the argument that they're trying to go with. And
Oh,
for
Lord help
me,
me, please.
right. And so for me, this brings up no intent. I meant intent, not impact.
Oh, sorry. For those of you that didn't see the question, let me
Yeah.
pop that up on the screen. So, one of our shows favorites, Dr. O'Rourke just asked, does he mean intent or impact? And that's yes. So that's an interesting difference. It is an interesting difference because, like, I meant to insult you and be rude to you. I just didn't mean to be racist when I
Right.
was doing it
No,
while
here's
using
the
racist
thing.
language.
Here's the thing.
What?
But he didn't. But he's arguing it wasn't even that. It was meant to be banter. right?
Isn't banter a two-way thing?
You would think so.
Isn't
But
isn't
even
banter
so,
when two equals can say something?
there would be that. But there's also a matter of familiarity that goes along with that, right? Look, I mean, my heritage is very mixed. So I tend to say a lot of things about a lot of different groups of people, right? But there's a Asian friend of mine who you know, I'm not going to say his name, but he will say things about black people and I will say things about Asian people. And it's because of that familiarity that we're able to talk about those stereotypes in that way because there's no malice behind it. And we both know we're not taking it seriously, right? So there's a familiarity, there's a back and forth, there's something that goes along that that's not built on a power dynamics hierarchy, right? But there's all, as I said, there's a knowledge of people, of cultures, of understanding, of all of these things that are not present in this case.
Yeah, but when you say familiarity, I feel like what people hear is, I am familiar with you enough to make that rudeness. Whereas what I think you're actually intending, or maybe I'm wrong, is our relationship is so deep that we can have a light-hearted, jesting, joking conversation and nobody misunderstands one another because we are so deeply connected that we can have those jokes. Whereas I think familiarity, maybe just to me, maybe other people don't take this, but I think sometimes when we use that term, people think, well, I work
Okay,
with you every day.
let,
No,
let-
son, you don't know me like that.
okay,
Like
let
I
me
can work
clarify
with
this.
you every day of my life and still not be in a relationship with you
The
deep
things
enough.
that we say,
That is
the things that we will say about each other and cultures and heritage, although I am partly from the same background as him, but the things that we will say, we would never say in anger,
right.
right?
And you would also never say to another person
No, I
because you
wouldn't.
know it would be offensive
It
to
would be
someone else.
offensive, right?
Amongst yourselves, because your relationship goes so deep and so far
Yeah.
back, you have built up trust that allows for that conversation. Whereas I think when people use the word, well, it was banter or we were familiar, those are very surface things that happen within, can happen within office situations or in this case, the locker room, but they're not environments in which trust has been built up enough that you can insult my mama and I'm not going to punch you in the face and hope your nose breaks. Right?
Well,
It just
that's another thing that I insult him about, but you know,
you see what I mean? It's like
no,
if let's take it away from race for a second. In those locker room situations, you've not got the trust on that deep
no.
personal level, most people, that you can insult their mama and not expect that that person's feelings are not going to be hurt because you don't
So
have the deepness.
when
So
when
when you say familiarity, I think people need to hear
right.
the
So
deepness of the relationship
when
in
I
that.
say familiar, I'm heavy on the family, right? We have that good a relationship.
Yeah.
So I understand banter, I understand all of these contexts, I understand joking about stereotypes, I understand all of these things, but this is none of it, right? Because when you take into account, and this takes into account Dr. O'Rourke's question of do I mean intent or impact?
Hmm.
Intent is something, so there's a difference between motive and intent. A motive can be a personal feeling or thought at the time, but I can project intent or ascertain intent based on a pattern of behaviors,
Okay.
right? So you can say that the incident that happened at that particular time, that wasn't your motive. But if I can demonstrate a pattern of behaviors, I can tell you your intent.
So you can. All right, so let me see if I understand this for the layperson amongst us, yeah? Let me see it. Let me see if I get this one. So, if you're looking at one incident, a person could say, "Well, I didn't mean for that to happen. My motives weren't like that. I was caught up in the heat of the discussion. I was caught up in the moment, blah 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 blah. So, I don't mean what I said, right? What you're saying is, if I then take away the oneness of it and I'm able to look at a time period, so the last year, let's say, and I see that you actually do this frequently, this then speaks to your intentions. You do this every single time. Like these kinds of things in all kinds of different situations build up a pattern, which tells me that your intention is to do XYZ. Like you intend to be like this.
Right.
This is,
So,
you're not dealing with your whatever.
for clarification's sake, in regards to this particular case,
Mhm.
I'm saying that a pattern of behavior can allow me to determine your intent.
Okay.
But intent can still be, and motive can still be a singular action. As I said, if I punch you in the nose, I may not intend to break it. That wasn't my intention. My intention was to punch you in the nose, but not to break it.
The
Motive, intent,
consequence and the impacts come afterwards. Like
right?
your nose breaking is a consequence or an impact of that.
And I'm saying to you, okay, so if I punch you in the nose and I don't
Mhm.
intend to break it, that's not something that I can possibly foresee or am foreseeing.
Okay.
Okay. With this case, where I can build up a pattern of behavior,
Right.
then it allows me to demonstrate that you should have the force or should be able to foresee the impact of your intentions.
Mhm.
Thus, it must be your intent
Mhm.
for the outcome that happens.
Mhm.
Right?
Which is the person is offended by your racist behavior.
Right.
Okay.
Now, here's the problem.
Mhm.
In allowing this person to claim that, or in the saying that this person is unconsciously racist,
Mhm.
one, what it does is it gives a get out clause to anybody who wants to be racist in future. One, it goes under the banner of banter, or
Mhm.
two, they'll just be like, hey, ask me the question you asked him. Right? In which case, no, I'm not consciously racist.
Splattering the N word everywhere. I'm not consciously racist.
Oh, that was the other thing that he did. So, in front of black players, he would intentionally mispronounce Arnold Schwarzenegger's surname, right?
Makes me tired.
Now, I'm like, you can't tell me it is not your intent to be offensive by using that word in front of a black person.
What I find interesting is that they're trying to claim unconscious when his version of racism is very specific to each group that he encounters. He can be prejudiced in very specific ways against Black people, against Asian people, against specific types of Asian people, against specific religious groups within Asian subcultures. He can do that all very specifically. So while it's all unconscious, he's very aware of every different group he's not misdoing this. Like he's not making a misstep and misapplying his unconscious bias to any other group. Like he's making this thing work
Let's put it like this. If
triple
we were
time.
talking about pretty much any other attribute in a person, say it was football, they were an actual footballer, we would say they were naturally gifted. So we just need to credit him with being a naturally gifted racist. Yeah? Look,
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but it's really interesting that the defense that they're using is unconscious bias when this man
right.
is quite versatile. Like,
But
you know,
what I want to get down to is the idea that this term unconscious bias is actually
mm,
doing more harm than it is good. Right? And it's not because I don't believe they don't exist. Right? I told you I grew up in a Britain in my younger years, in my youthful years, in a Britain in which, as I said, I could recognize a person like this. And I'm just going to be real. My bias was, and I'd probably say it probably wasn't even unconscious. It erred on the side of caution, and it was a matter of more experience than bias. But if you saw a white person that looked a certain way approaching you on a dark road, you knew you had to be on guard.
Okay, so I grew up, so now to back up your point, in terms of unconscious bias, so I grew up in an era where the National Front, particularly in my road, and because we lived on a main road, marched down our street, right? They were constantly a lovely force of presence. And for those of you that are not part of British subcultures, you may not know them. They're a racist group who were typified by skinheads, and yeah, they had a certain look to them.
So the British version of the KKK.
Yes. And they had their particular look, right? And so for me, a white male whose head is shaved, I would get immediately nervous around. And for a long time, it took me a while to figure out what was happening. If I was alone in any kind of situation and there was a white male with a shaved head, which we would call in my colloquial words a skinhead, I would get really uncomfortable. And to this day, that's something I have to work to overcome. And I have been told stories of how they've been kind and helpful, and I've met those that are lovely and wonderful. But my immediate default, because of seeing as a small child the anger and hatred and the what have you just coming out of them, not knowing anything other than what I'm seeing, it put something into me that even in I'll be in general population doing my own business, not really thinking about anything, and I will have the let's avoid them.
Right.
And I will have to now as an adult consciously go, okay, and be realistic, be sensible. What are you doing? Why are you panicking? What's happening with your breathing? Calm down. This is ridiculous. And that is, it's both it has a conscious, like I now know I can identify what happened and why I have that. But that used to be a breathing pattern I had as a child. And it took my mum to actually identify that that's what I was doing. And I didn't know. And
Right.
from that
And
time on, I'm doing that.
as I've gotten older, I have recognized that there was classism at play in that. And I say that because that was the image of the racism that was projected, right?
Yes.
But
Yes.
more harm was done to me by a white man in a suit and a tie than with
Oh,
a poor man with a
with the
skinhead
skinhead.
and tattoos.
I have more in
Right?
common with the poor man with the skinhead than I do with the man with the shirt and tie.
Right.
So,
So
Jason
there's classism, but once again, these all filter into biases that we have. So I
right.
recognize that they exist.
Okay,
Right?
so what you're not saying is that bias and unconscious bias doesn't exist, because we've both identified
No.
unconscious bias that we grew up with, that we took later times to identify and to unpack. Jason's just come up with this, which I just want to see. I wonder if this works. Bias trajectory, unconscious bias, subconscious bias, conscious bias, prejudice, discrimination, and segregation. So instead of saying that there's unconscious bias, there is a bias trajectory. Maybe that's something you could have instead, since you're saying that the term unconscious bias does more harm than good.
I'm gonna have to ruminate. Well, he's talking about bias trajectory and the way that it works. I'm gonna have to
Yes.
ruminate on that one.
Yeah.
But what I will say is that what is happening now is that racist people who are blatantly, overtly, patently racist are now using unconscious or subconscious bias as a get out of jail free card. Now, what I want to do is I want to make a connection between stories.
Okay.
Right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Okay. So we had a few weeks ago in the UK, there was I think I don't know if we spoke about this story. Darkside, yes, it was still running then. Ngozi
Elodie.
Filoni
Mhm.
went to the palace, was asked by one of the people there, "Where are
Where are
you
you
really
from?
from?" And she answers, and she's like, "No, where are you really from? No, where are you really from?" Basically saying, "You're not British." Although she was told, "No, I'm British. I was born here." The question, "Where are you really from?" persisted. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle say, "No, we love this woman." Okay. It was unconscious bias that she exhibited. Now, here's the problem. We had Eddie Hippolyte on
Yeah, Darkside,
a
yeah.
while back, and he said he didn't like the phrase unconscious bias. What he preferred was unexamined bias.
Okay,
Right?
okay, okay.
I'm okay with that. I'll probably go a step further and say unchallenged bias, but I'm okay with unexamined bias.
Okay.
Right.
You start
Now,
writing these
here's the
notes
thing.
down for future reference.
Here's the thing. She may have exhibited unexamined bias initially. And when I say initially, I mean the first one or two times you ask that question. But when you persist with that and that line of questioning, you're not stupid. Your brain processes kick in. And at some point, you are processing ways to ask this question. Your brain is refusing to take in the questions that are the answers to the question that you've asked,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
So it's no longer unconscious.
mhm, mhm,
This is a conscious thought process that you are now engaged with,
mhm,
right? So to say that she exhibited unconscious bias is once again to excuse her behavior,
mm. Okay.
right? So now we have a story of a footballer or a
Mhm,
football coach.
mhm.
We have the royal family. What's the connection between the two?
Power and wealth.
That's one. The president of the Football Association
Mhm.
is Prince William,
Oh, royalty.
right? So now what you have to consider is this. Harry and Meghan are saying
Oh.
the royal institution is not fit for purpose. She encountered terrible racism within it, right?
Mhm,
You now have footballers who are experiencing racism, and the panel over which is meant to bring the charges
mhm,
against them is led, or the institution is headed up by a member of the institution in which one of its own members is saying is racist.
yeah, yeah.
Right? So here's the thing. At which point do you say that all of this is intentional?
Are you
If
waiting for a response? No, good. Okay.
Harry is
Mhm,
saying
mhm, mhm,
the royal family's racist,
mhm, mhm,
if footballers are saying this institution, which is headed by Prince William, is not fit for purpose and is leaving us open to abuse and
mhm,
is excusing racists, is
mhm,
not calling them out by their proper name.
mhm,
At which point do you point to the person at the top? Because here's the thing, there's a wonderful line from a movie, Remember the Titans.
mhm. Denzel
And
Washington movie.
yes, right?
Mhm, mhm,
And it says attitude reflects leadership.
mhm, mhm, mhm,
At which point do you say the attitudes of the Football Association towards racists and racism and
mhm,
the attitudes of the royal family towards race are reflective of the leadership? And if
mhm,
it's reflective of the leadership, it must be intentional. Because here's the thing. For decades, people have been saying racism is about education. Racism is about education, and I actually don't believe that. But people have been saying it for decades, right?
Mhm.
Well, we're talking about people that have had the best educations in the world, have been to some of the best educational systems, some institutions, and are still managing to somehow preside over institutions that are patently racist, patently sexist, patently xenophobic, patently transphobic, patently homophobic. You list the name of phobics, and you will find it within these two institutions.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so, for me, allowing people to continue to use the phrase unconscious bias is simply a way in which people of power and of privilege get to continue their abuses and say, I did not know.
Mm. Okay. 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 Dr. O'Rourke has just popped in to say, and this royalty has had a century to examine its bias and history practices, and they simply have gone until recently unchallenged. So this goes back to your point that really what we're talking about is unchallenged or unexamined biases. Yeah, I think for me I think this was a difficult subject in that I do think that we are fed so much information that we take in, particularly when you see children, how they take information in. They're taking in as much as of what you tell them as they are of all of the things that are going on around. And this is all happening on an unconscious level to a certain degree. You know, you're processing it in your sleep, you're waking up and you're making those decisions. And it worried me to say that things are so there's sort of no middle ground. You're just consciously doing all of these things. Is that really what's happening? Because people do have just, oh, I didn't realize, oh, I make this connection I never noticed before. And some of us have sat in therapy rooms to try and work that out. Some of us have talked in different circles. Some of us have had mixed group of friendships, etc., which have forced us to have those conversations. So I think instead of saying let's get rid of the idea of unconscious bias, let's replace it with unchallenged bias, seems better in that you're actually given a good replacement. My other concern, though, is as with all terms, as with anything that happens, it's more than the term. They will just find a new excuse. The term will change and they will simply change their tact and come up with a new excuse. It doesn't matter what the term is and how that term is being used. The fact of the matter is, when you say unconscious bias, it's not these situations that you've talked about are not unconscious bias. They are most certainly conscious bias. Them using it in this way is an inappropriate use of the term, and that should be challenged. And we can withdraw unconscious bias off the table. They're still going to be abusive. They're still going to do this, just with a different label that they come up with, taking a term, misusing it, abusing it, and then applying it to themselves so they can get away with something. Because anyone who understands the case of the Crawley manager will know it's not unconscious bias. That
Yeah,
is in no way the definition. I mean, we read through the definitions. None of those definitions would
no,
fit this gentleman's idea of what unconscious bias is. When you persistently do something for over however many decades, persistently continue to be racist, it's not unconscious.
right. And
You're
I agree.
enjoying that process. And if you say it's banter, that means you're enjoying it even more, because what you've actually said is, I'm being consciously racist and I'm doing it under the guise of banter because I think it's funny and I'm getting away with it. Oh, your eyes went really wide and haven't moved. Has the screen frozen? It looks like the screen's frozen at the perfect expression. Someone take a picture. Okay, so agreed, says Dr. Reich. This is how it's being taught. It assumes positive intent and ignorance. It assumes naivety and innocence. which gives racists more time to be racist instead of demanding immediate change. Thank you. I think we may have lost Mr. Storm. Oh no, he's back. I'll take that.
Right. What I was trying to say was, I agree with you in regards to the fact that people will change tact surrounding what if we change terms. But I think unchallenged bias is more empowering to people that suffer racism,
Okay.
right? Because what that means is it's something there to be challenged
Right. Right. So it
rather
gives
than
you the
somebody getting to say, I'm ignorant of this. It says to the person that when you are faced with these things,
you
you are
have a
in a
right
place
to
right,
come up against it and say, hey, that's not
right,
right. That's an unchallenged bias. Let
right,
me challenge your understanding.
right. And I think the other thing to bear
Okay,
in
well, that's
mind,
fair enough.
and I think the other thing to bear in mind when we're talking about unconscious biases is that these are not permanent things or beliefs,
Now that's
right?
100%
These
right.
are things that can be shaped,
Mm-hmm.
and that can be formed,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think they differ very much, or where, no, not that they differ much, that where we tend to verge into racism is when you consciously choose not to examine your biases. Where we go into sexism is where you consciously choose not to examine your biases,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? Um, one of the things that we need to understand is that biases form in many ways as a protective measure,
Right.
right? You may rightly or wrongly be taught biases,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? But they serve to protect you.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if I touch something that's hot once, I'm going to be predisposed not to do it again.
Mm-hmm.
If I see you do something once and it harms you, I'm going to be predisposed not to do it myself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the existence of them, as I said, I have no problems with.
Right.
But I also know I don't touch a hot pot. I might go put a mitt on to pick it up. I might. It's how do I deal with these things? I don't
Mm-hmm.
just accept that everything is how it is. That things cannot be changed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in order for me to do that, it takes a conscious effort. And
Mm-hmm.
so, it's the same with unconscious bias. When somebody comes to you and says, "Look, this is what you said. This is what you did.
Mm-hmm.
This is how it hurt me. This is how it's wrong."
Mm-hmm.
I'm okay to roll with that, you know. But I think in many ways, part of it stems from the fact that I am aware of the privileges that I have, as well as the disadvantages.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard to have conversations with people that do not acknowledge their privileges. If you don't, you are unlikely to be the kind of person that's going to confront your biases.
All right. Well, I think that's been deeply challenging and interesting, and certainly gives us a way forward as a group, especially here on the dark side as we talk about these topics. I think it's given us something to ruminate over, as you would say, the idea that what we're really talking about is unchallenged bias, and that an unconscious bias is simply one that has been unchallenged in that
Right.
situation.
There is still one factor that I wanted to touch on,
Okay.
and that is, sorry, okay, and that is what. First of all, there's a something that's called the implicit association test, which you can take to measure how you
Hmm.
relate things and your biases.
Hmm.
But it was in something you said in the beginning, in the idea of the disappointment that people have about going backwards, and what I said about the fact that to the powerful, justice seems like oppression.
Okay.
I think, oh, now I've lost my thought. Now
I
you know.
didn't do it.
No, you didn't do it. Um,
Wasn't me.
what's to do with the implicit? Oh, that's what I was going to say. One of the problems is that when you do these trainings, you can mandate for outcomes. You can legislate for outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But you cannot change a person's beliefs if they don't wish to change. And so what you have is that results of like this implicit association test you talked about, or you spoke about, or you mentioned, um, difference in outcomes in the health profession.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that these tests have managed to bring about is awareness in the disparity between Black people being given pain relief and white people being given pain relief. Black and white people being believed when they say they're in pain
Mm-hmm.
and they go to the hospital. Now, here's the thing. I said all of these trainings, they can highlight, they can bring about, they can enable you to put in place um, systems to try and decrease the impact
Mm-hmm.
that these biases have.
Mm-hmm.
But they will never help you to eradicate them from a person. That has to be done intentionally.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes effort. And unfortunately, people don't want to put in effort.
Mm-hmm.
And what I equate it to is when the whole Black Lives Matter issues were kicking off, white people were coming to me saying, "What do I do? I didn't know. Tell me more about this." There's hundreds of books on the subject. Pick one up and read it. Do the
Mm-hmm.
work.
Mm-hmm.
But
Or
that's
at the very least, read something and then come back to me with a question that you've read something.
listen, I will even take that. My point is put in some effort, do some work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you don't do that, you can't expect me to believe that you're committed to something.
Yeah. Well, this is an ongoing challenge. And so Dr. O'Rourke said it's working with ethics, not one's morals, beliefs, values, or identities. Well, I think what you're raising here is a great tension. Look, in the work that we and many, many other people do, one of the things that we know to be true is we certainly can't change what you believe. I can't make you believe something. I can't force you to do something. What I can do is make it legislatively impossible for you to act on those beliefs without incurring a penalty. And that's really important because over time, that should make at least the outcomes for people who are dealing with those types of people better.
Well, here's the irony. Those systems should eventually create in somebody an unconscious bias to not do those things.
Yeah, right, precisely. So eventually over time, and again, I think this goes back to an earlier point that I said, which is one of the things that reading about unconscious bias, knowing that we've done training on unconscious bias for people in different organizations, one of the things that always strikes me is that people always want you to come in for an hour and do your training and then everything will be better. Look how we go, right? And the thing that we always say is we can do 1 hour with you, but you learned this over an entire lifetime. And you cannot undo a lifetime's of work in 1 hour. It's not going to happen. It takes a lifetime to work the other way. Like you are going to have to actively seek it out every single time to undo it. And that goes for all of us. You know, we all have biases, and we talked about very personal biases that we experience. And I said, to this day, I still have to take that deep breath and go, that is an unconscious bias. Let's look at the facts in front of you, dig in deep, work out what's happening. Don't immediately judge based on this one look that you have an immediate reaction to. That takes a lifetime of work of being consciously and putting in the effort to actually see the humanity in someone else. If people aren't willing to do that, then that's not going to work. The difference is I don't have any power to affect anyone's life. Me having a slight panic attack is not going to affect anyone's life around me. I'm not going to do that. The very big problem and the very real danger is that a person in power does affect people's lives, be that doctors, be that employers, be that institutions like the Football Association, ad infinitum to all of the different institutions. You do have the power to affect someone else's life, and it's important that you act on those biases, but they're not going to change overnight.
More importantly, they don't want to change.
Well, there you go. There you go. But for today, some stuff for you to ruminate over. We thank you very much for joining us for our first week back on the Darkside. We have enjoyed our discussion. Next week's topic we will release as the week goes along. We're trying to look at topics that are based within this area and field of education, using different case studies within the weekly news cycle to help us explain them. So we hope this is helpful to you. We hope that you're getting some good information out of this to begin your journey to ruminate on these things, to maybe unpack some of these topics that you haven't unpacked before, or maybe you have, but unpack them in a slightly different way, because after all, this is the dark side.
I have one question actually for Dr. O'Rourke, and it's to do with his earlier comment. How would he differentiate between unconscious and subconscious bias? I'm just thinking over his trajectory, his bias trajectory. So, yeah.
Hit each other up with the answer to that one. We'll all tune in next week for how that went. He's currently ruminating, which is always good. We thank you so much. I've been your host, Tabitha Purple, and my co-host for today is Mr. Storm. We thank you so much for tuning in. Please like, share, do the thing that gets us to whoever needs this wonderful information. And we will see you next time on the dark side, 9 p.m. CET time. Yeah. Do I need to say anything else? Have I remembered all the things?
think
Okay,
so.
it must be your time to say goodbye then. Bye. See you next time on the dark side. Which one is the one that's ending? I think